Well, everyone, we are moving into chapter 3, so we're going back. We were just in 8, now we're going back to 3. So I want to take you through some of the steps that you need to do for this chapter and things to think about. I did post in Blackboard for you guys all the pages that you need to read for chapter 3. Some of these things I'm going to point out today, but some of that I would like for you to go through the book to do those things. I find that this chapter is very good about just kind of explaining certain techniques to use, like a portrait sharpening and stuff like that, and really just those settings to get started. So some of that I'm going to leave for you guys to do on your own, and just use the book as a reference, especially when it comes to the assignment, which I'll explain in a little bit. The book is a very good reference for those things, and some of the things we talk about. If you remember talking about presets a week or two ago, you can actually create presets of all of these sharpening techniques that are discussed, even the noise reduction. I'm not really going to talk about the noise reduction right now, however, I put the chapters down for you guys to read. So I do want you to read through that handful of pages. We're going to come back to noise reduction with a few other things, but think about how you might use these, or if you find these beneficial. It would be worth creating the preset, and it does also remind you of how to do that in this chapter too, so use that as a resource. Now, one thing some people have asked is they like to use, it's easier to follow along with the images in the book than using your own, just to see how it looks on the image being used in the book, and then knowing how it will look on an image of your own when you're working either within Camera Raw or Photoshop. So I just wanted to show you where to get those images from. At the front of the book, you'll see the website link for photoshopforphotographers.com. If you go there, it's a few clicks in, but I'm pretty sure you'll be able to get there, but you can click on the book, and then there is a section that says Access Online Content. And then, yet again, you have to pick the correct book here because there's a couple different versions. It's the first one, the current book that we're using, Access Online Content. And there's a ton of stuff in here. Some stuff I haven't even gone through yet, but there are a lot of great resources. So you'll see some good resources for the tools palette and understanding what every single tool is for, even the layer styles. If you're using those and you don't fully understand what each one does, this is crazy how it goes through each one. But then the one you want to look for if you're trying to do the stuff from the book is the images. And you'll see the chapter, this is the book we have, is this first one right here. So you can click on like chapter 3, the one we're using, to download, which I already have. And then once it has downloaded, I put mine on my desktop here. Once it's downloaded, it's a zip file. You simply double click and it will automatically expand that file and give you the folder. And then you'll have all the images that are used in this chapter. So some are JPEGs, some are DNGs, and some are TIFFs. All of this, except for maybe a couple, will be opening in Camera Raw. So since they are, some of these are JPEGs and TIFFs, in order to open them from Camera Raw, we need to use Bridge. So I'll open Bridge and I'll get to that file so that we can drag this, drag this down into Bridge so that it opens right to the folder and I don't have to go looking for it. Here we go. So we're going to use all these images today. Now, as we get started and we talk about sharpening today, there are some good tidbits of information at the beginning of this chapter. I'll point out a couple of things, but you'll read through this also again on your own. So when we talk about sharpening, what's interesting about sharpening, and I apologize if you can hear my computer because the fan is taking over. One thing about sharpening is that if you photograph in a JPEG, cameras will automatically apply a sharpening and a noise reduction to images photographed in JPEG. Some people really appreciate that because then your images are pretty much ready to go. Now, other images, like a RAW file, when you photograph that, no matter what you set your camera to, it is not going to matter what you apply for sharpening settings on your camera, because a RAW file does not place that information or bake that information into the image itself. So when you open a RAW file, you'll notice that a RAW file has a default setting, sharpening setting in there. Let me just open up this test one they're going to use first. I'm going to do a Command R, open in RAW. If I go to the sharpening tab, or the detail tab, sorry, which is the third tab from the left, in sharpening right now, you'll see I have a TIFF open. So the amount slider is set to 0. When you open a TIFF or a JPEG, it assumes that sharpening has been applied to that image, either in camera or via another way or technique. So it doesn't apply any sharpening. However, if I go back out here and get I don't know if it'll show up on one of these, but let's try it. If I go to another image, see, this one's been adjusted already. Maybe I can find you guys one really quick here. Buried in the bowels of my hard drive. Sure. Just one image. Sender. Yeah, we'll get the test shot. You'll see when you go to sharpening, Camera Raw applies a default amount of 25, radius of 1, detail of 15. This is a standard because when the Camera Raw plugin recognizes a RAW file, it is knowingly applying sharpening because no sharpening has been applied to this image. And another part in this chapter at the beginning is it talks about how one-step sharpening is not very effective. We have to sharpen at multiple levels in our workflow. So one, maybe right inside the camera. It's kind of a pre-workflow or pre-sharpening is kind of what it's doing, because it's all done right inside the camera. Otherwise, when we open an image, especially a RAW file, that first level of sharpening is often applied right in the Camera Raw plugin, or it may be actually the second step, depending on what we're doing. But there's other things to think about too. There's kind of that input stage, there's the editing stage, and then there's the output stage. And usually at either 2 or 3 of those places, you are applying sharpening in some way, shape, or form. Either input or during your editing, you're applying sharpening. So either one or both. And then the last one, which is output, most of the time, almost all of the time I should say, some type of sharpening is applied depending on what it's for. If it's a web image, you might apply a certain sharpening that's specific for the web. If it's a print, you might apply another level of sharpening to go to print. So we use what's called a multi-step process when it comes to sharpening images before they get sent out for whatever their final result or product is going to be. So I'm going to cancel this. Now, one other thing too when we talk about sharpening is in Camera Raw, when it comes to raw images, maybe I shouldn't have closed that. When it comes to raw images, Camera Raw has 2 different process versions of how it processes a raw file. And in the camera calibration tab, which is actually third from the right, you'll see what's used now by default is the 2012 process version. Older versions may have used the 2010, that was kind of short-lived, but then prior to that was the 2003 version. Really, it's just the year the version came out, basically, and what it does and applies to the image as part of the calibration for the raw file prior to editing it in Photoshop. So this 2012 version, and kind of look at the examples in the book too, they show you the differences. What happens often is there's a slight sharpening that's applied. There is might be some noise reduction that's applied, among a few other things. They're just algorithms that are put together to say, here's a raw file, apply this to it because every raw file needs this coming out of the camera. So when you read through that, hopefully that'll make a little bit of sense as it's being explained. But just know that there are different process versions. The most current one is definitely the best to use. Older ones did a good job, but now that we have cameras with more megapixels, they take up more space, the files are larger, there are more pixels to edit. The 2003 version doesn't work as well as far as getting rid of noise, doing sharpening, or that auto sharpening in the details tab when you open the raw file, and things like that. So just know it'll apply whatever the most current one is. If you have an old image, it will probably apply an older version, but you can always come in the camera calibration tab and you can change it to the most current version. For most of you, this is not going to be an issue, so don't worry. But if you come across an old raw file, you can go ahead and change the process version. So let's talk a little bit about sharpening here. Like I said, I want to kind of walk through some of the thought processes behind sharpening, but I want you to go through some of the steps in the book. So one of the things I want to talk about is that detail panel in itself. I'm going to bring up the image. Oops, sorry. So I'm going to bring up the image here that they're using as a sample in the book. You'll see there's building reflection and a bunch of lines and stuff, and this will kind of help as you see some of the sharpening take place, along with the face here when we look at sharpening things like eyes, but trying not to sharpen the skin, and so on. So I'm going to momentarily turn off my highlight and shadow clipping warning, just because it's distracting to what we're working on. So when we look at the Detail tab, in the Detail tab, again, this is a TIFF, so the amount is set to 0. But what I want to explain is what the amount slider is, what the radius slider is, the detail, and the masking. Some of this stuff we've talked briefly about, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So the first two controls are probably the ones that you're going to use and toggle and play with the most. The first one's the amount slider. That basically is exactly what you think, the amount of sharpening being applied to the image. It does go in essentially percentages, but 100 being 100%. However, you'll notice that you can go beyond what's considered 100%. And there's a reason for that. Reason being is not so you can sharpen more than you probably need to. When you start moving things like the detail slider, you find you have to adjust the amount a little bit, and sometimes that requires going above 100% to get what you want. So that is the reason why that amount slider goes above 100. The radius is basically how the sharpening gets applied. And I know that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's in your book will say it's how it gets distributed. So it's really how, and let me see if I can overdo this a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. Oh, it's kind of hard there. You can kind of see the difference here between a radius of 1 and a radius of 2.4. So the radius is when you have a pixel that's being sharpened, how many surrounding pixels are being sharpened with it. That's probably the easiest way to understand it. So if I have 0.9, that means it's going to be a very fine sharpening. So if you have fine lines like hair, stuff like that that you're trying to keep the detail in, that radius is going to be much smaller than other things you might sharpen, because as it gets bigger, now in this image it pixelates it because I'm zoomed in so far, but it kind of blends everything together here because it's distributing it so many pixels all the way around the pixel that's being sharpened. So the overall effect isn't good in this case, especially since I'm looking at the area with the hair. So the amount is kind of that area around the areas being sharpened and how wide that area is. Now the other two sliders are what we call suppression controls. So while these two apply the sharpening, these two suppress the sharpening. You'll see as we drag up the detail slider, it's suppressing the sharpening by adding additional detail in there. And the masking does something we've talked about before. As we drag it, it masks out, think of it as a layer mask for Camera Raw. It masks out areas of the image that you don't want the sharpening to be applied to. And it's hard to understand what each one does without dragging from one end of the slider to the other. So one thing I recommend is that wonderful, wonderful Option key. And when you drag and hold that down, any one of these sliders is either going to turn gray, kind of like a high pass filter if you've used that before in Photoshop. You'll see it turn gray showing some detail, and the masking slider will turn black and white. So let me do that for you. I'm going to hold down the Option or the Alt key, and I'm going to slide this. Now in the amount slider, it doesn't do a whole lot. I don't find it to be horribly beneficial. It's the radius and the detail where I think you're going to use it the most. So in the radius slider, as I drag it, you're going to see kind of the edges of what's being sharpened. So you can see when it's smaller, the edges are much finer, and as you drag it up, it's a little bit more bulky as far as what's being sharpened. Then in the detail slider, you can see here how it's adding some detail, but also kind of controlling where the sharpening is happening to a certain degree. Because as more detail is added, sharpening is added to those areas of detail. And then last is the masking. And this is similar to what we've used in the basic panel, where as I grab and drag it, it masks out certain areas of an image. So as I drag it up, what you can see is that it's not affecting her skin, but still sharpening her eyes and her hair, which probably gives you a better result. Let's go back here. There we go. So you can see I don't want to sharpen skin. Skin, when you're retouching portraits, you want to keep that softer. So by masking out the skin, I'm applying sharpening here, which is where you want it to be sharp, but I'm not affecting this area here. So hold down the Option key, play around with it, and see if it all starts to come to you as you're goofing around with it. When you read through the book, when you're reading through the portion where it's using this image as an example, they do have some screenshots that talk about like a Photoshop simulation of what we're trying to do here. Don't let that confuse you. Basically, what they're doing is they're just saying, think of this sharpening technique as this technique that's done in Photoshop. Only you're doing it in Camera Raw. So they're just showing you a different thought process to try and help understand what it's talking about. But don't let that confuse you, because I know the first time I went through the book, it was a little confusing that suddenly we were in Camera Raw, and then all of a sudden it was in Photoshop, and there were masks and layers, but that's not what that is. That's simply just a simulation to show you a different thought process for exactly what you're doing in Raw. It has nothing to do with actually doing this in Photoshop at the moment. So now the one thing I want you to start going through is starting at page 276. He walks through Camera Raw and sharpening, but for several different variations. One for portrait sharpening, one for landscape sharpening, another one for sharpening fine details, and then it does talk about saving presets while you're in there too. There also is a section that talks about using the adjustment brush for sharpening to do localized adjustments. And I want to point something out here. I'm going to open up the image that they're using. When you get to that part, it is on page 282. So I'm going to open this up, Command R, in Camera Raw, And basically what they're saying is that when you look close at this image, certain ones, let me get my hand tool, certain images are more trees are more in focus than others, and it appears to be more of the background than the foreground. So what they're doing is they're going to apply sharpening to just the trees in the foreground to give them more detail, as the other trees have. Now they're using an adjustment brush to do this. However, I want to point out that when you use the adjustment brush, and I'm going to hit the K to get to the adjustment brush right here, you're going to see that the sharpness options that you have are simply just a slider up and down from 100%. But you actually have more control than you think you do over sharpening, because when the adjustment brush sharpens at whatever essentially percentage you tell it to, it is pulling the information from whatever settings are in the detail slider. So what that means is that in the detail slider, if the amount of sharpening I'm applying is 90, my detail, let's crank that just a little bit here. I'm just going to add some masking in here for the moment. But so if these are my settings, when I go to the adjustment brush and I choose to brush a new one, I'm going to reset some of this stuff here. But sharpness, I'm going to crank that up. It is using those settings that I just set at almost like an opacity, if that's easier to understand. So these lovely settings in the detail slider of my amount, my details, my radius, it's using that with this adjustment brush. I hope that makes sense. Another thing I think is kind of fun is we think of sharpening as exactly that, sharpening, making the image sharper on edges, overall, certain areas, whatever it may be. And we often forget about negative sharpening. Negative sharpening is kind of a lot of fun. Let me open up this image right here, and let's see. There we go. So this image, the goal of this image, and this is in the book too, it's on page 284. The goal of this one is to do a negative sharpening effect, meaning I don't want as much detail in this background. I want to bring some of the focus more to the foreground and what's happening over here. So rather than try and blur something or whatever it may be, I can just use negative sharpening. I really like using this technique, and I think it'll work well for things that you want to do too. So for this example in the book, yes, you can use the adjustment brush. However, what they did is they actually used the graduated filter. So they used this filter right here, and rather than sharpening something, they took away sharpness. They went in the negative direction. I'm just going to draw this to begin to show you. Trying to see how far they drag this, as far as I am. And then by dragging it in the negative direction, you can see it's blurring the background right here. So to create that, essentially this is like creating depth of field in Camera Raw, if that makes any sense whatsoever. I'm creating this depth of field by blurring out this background. Like I said, the adjustment brush works well. I think for this one, the graduated filter does work well. I might also take the adjustment brush then too with the same sharpness or negative sharpening effect and brush around this clock here just to kind of get that level here, this plane, this same blur without affecting the clock too much. Or I could just use the adjustment brush for the whole thing so that this clock that's at a different focal plane than the background can stay in focus and everything else falls out. So this is called negative sharpening. Now there are different ways of doing negative sharpening. You can also do negative sharpening inside Photoshop in a variety of different ways. So think about everything that we're doing, even though we're doing most of it in Camera Raw, as something that can be done in Photoshop too. I find being a non-destructive edit, Camera Raw would definitely be the better option for you, but you can use whatever you would like. I'm skipping over the noise reduction for exactly what reason I said before. We're going to talk about a little bit more with some other things, but I think noise reduction for the most part is a pretty simple concept to understand. Sharpening tends to have a lot more variations in what you can do, so that's why we're going to focus a bit more on that one. As you go through noise reduction and the end of the chapter comes back to doing another sharpening effect, or negative sharpening effect actually, it talks about adding grain to an image to improve sharpening. We often think, let me get out of this here, out of here, do I have the image? This one. We often think when we're working with an image that, let's go back here. Try to show you the difference here. I'm going to have to go in ridiculously close. Okay, so in this first step here, this is pretty much the original image for the most part, but what they're doing is they're applying some sharpening. In the second step, they're applying some grain to add some more detail back to the image, but I know that looks not quite right. It looks a little noisy because you've added grain. In step 3, what they've done, and it's kind of hard to see it on here, but what they've done is they've done another adjustment to compensate for the grain but still sharpen some of that detail that's been added in. This is a technique that's been used over and over before Camera Raw even existed. I used to do this to images, scanned images even, where when you scan them in they don't have the detail that you want, so you sharpen them a little bit. You add a little bit of grain, which in Photoshop it's called noise, and then you apply just a slight blur, sharpen it again, add a little bit of grain or noise, do a slight blur to kind of wipe out some of this noise from the grain, and then you do that step over and over again until you get the sharpness that you want. I even got to the point where I created an action of it so that I could just click the button and it would just slowly bring back some of the sharpness and the detail. However, now I think it's a bit easier because we can use Camera Raw to do something like that. Again, those steps are in the book for you. One of the last things that I want to talk about has to do with localized sharpening, but doing it in Photoshop. So I'm going to cancel out of here. I'm going to pick an image, this one, and I'm going to open this image into Photoshop, not Camera Raw. So I'm just simply going to double click from Bridge. It's going to open in Photoshop, and then I'm going to use a filter to do a sharpening effect, because let's face it, we're not going to use Camera Raw for absolutely everything. There are some times where you're just going to want to use Photoshop to do things, any type of edit, and using sharpening within Photoshop is equally as acceptable as doing it in Camera Raw. So I'm going to zoom in here so you can kind of see some of the detail. Now that in this particular image, the foreground is crisp, clear, it looks great. As you scroll up, as you scroll up and you get to the background, you see some of that, it's just depth of field, it starts to fall off just a little bit. And this building, though very lovely in the distance, is not as sharp as everything else. And for this particular image, it's kind of a focal point, so I think it should be a bit sharper to match that foreground. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Photoshop to do exactly that. We're going to use a filter. I'm going to go in the filter menu here and just show you something. There are a ton of sharpening options here. Play with these. Shake reduction is great. The book talks about shake reduction. Unsharp mask is probably the one that's used more often than anything else when it comes to sharpening. It's been around for what seems like all eternity. And unsharp mask, which is, the name is kind of counterintuitive, but it really does a great job of sharpening, and you'll see that you have similar sliders like you did in Camera Raw, an amount and a radius. The threshold is very much like, almost like a combination of the detail in the masking slider in Camera Raw, so that as you apply a threshold, it's essentially masking out some of that effect. That setting's usually really low, but everything else here is similar to what we've been talking about so far. But the filter I want to talk about is the Smart Sharpen. This is kind of a cool filter. It takes a little bit of getting used to. I'll even admit I probably don't use it as much as I should because I'm so used to the Unsharp Mask one, but it does take just a little bit of playing within it to get it just right. But there's a lot of control in here, even more than what we're going to go through. I'll point it out, but I won't talk about every single aspect that it has. It's too much right now. Right now you want to focus on just understanding the basics of each of these sharpening techniques. So the Smart Sharpen has several different ways to remove either blur, or actually it is all these different ways to remove blur in order to sharpen the image. So one thing it has is a little drop down at the bottom, and there's 3 different types of blur that it removes. It removes a Gaussian blur, it removes a lens blur, and then it also removes a motion blur. So it's kind of cool if you're a little shaky on something, you can take this motion blur and you can tip it at the angle that the blur occurred, and then as you increase the amounts and stuff like that, it tries to correct and bring those pixels back together to give you that sharp image. I'm going to go back to lens blur here. But what I'm doing with this image is I'm going to apply a sharpen. Oh, and let me double check something here. I'm going to do something before I apply this sharpen. Something I recommend everyone does. Create a smart object. See this background layer? So in the layer palette, here's the background layer. Right now it's a locked layer. If I apply Smart Sharpen, it is simply going to apply the sharpening to the image, and that's it. Whenever I use a filter or do whatever type of edit I'm doing, if at all possible, and make it a smart object, because this allows me to be non-destructive, like a raw image in the Camera Raw plugin. I can go back to it, I can adjust settings, I can tweak it just a little bit, and then I can delete it. I can do whatever it is I want without doing anything to the original image. So for this image, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to convert this to a smart object. So now it unlocks it, changes the name of the layer to layer 0, give this little icon, means it's a smart object, and now when I go to Smart Sharpen, now when I go to Smart Sharpen, it's going to apply it, you'll see how it applies in a second, but it's going to apply it as a filter, a smart filter attached to the original image. And I'll explain that in a second. So I'm just going to follow through some of the steps that he's using in the book, just so you can see the finished example. But what he does is he starts with this image, he converts it to a smart object, which I've done already, and then gone into the Smart Sharpen filter. Make sure that the blur we're trying to remove is a lens blur. It's a lens blur because we didn't necessarily have the right depth of field, and so, or the lens shoots a certain way that it throws things out of focus. So what we're going to do is we're going to correct that lens blur, regardless of whose fault it was, and we're going to set some of these settings here. So this amount slider, we're actually going to crank up to what I consider an uncomfortable level, but it's about 440 is what he was using in the textbook. It's kind of a crazy amount. However, we're going to bring that radius down quite a bit, somewhere in the 2 range. And then this reduce noise, and this is what's cool about the Smart Sharpen. Sometimes when you sharpen, noise is brought out. Reduce noise is essentially compensating for that. You can also consider it to a degree part of like the detail and the masking slider, but you'll see reduce noise does work very well once you start sharpening. So this setting is going to be fairly low. I'm not going to go too far, just enough to take out a tiny bit. I think he has 5 in the book, but we'll kind of go in that general area. Now when I'm done, I can simply click OK. The only thing I want to show you before I come out of this Smart Sharpen is there's a little drop down arrow here. It says highlights and shadows. You can take Smart Sharpen to the next level. Again, I'm simply pointing it out. I'm not going to sit and explain the whole thing, but you can play with it. It allows you to tweak how the highlights and the shadows are being sharpened, and maybe where a fade is between highlight and shadow and the detail that's showing. It's a great addition to sharpening, the basic sharpening sliders up here, because it's just giving you a whole nother level of control. They're very much advanced settings. So I'm going to collapse that. I'm going to click OK. Now here's what's going to happen because this is a smart object. When I click OK, it takes me back to my image, but what's different is that my smart object layer now has a smart filter, and that smart filter is the Smart Sharpen. And what that means is that at any time, if I decide I do not like the settings here, I can double click on Smart Sharpen, goes back to the pop-up window, and I can tweak this however I want. And that's exactly why we want to use smart objects as often as possible. So I'm going to crank this back up a little bit here. I'm just going to leave the rest. Now here's the other bonus to using smart objects with smart layers. One thing I can do is take advantage of this right here. This is a mask, just like layer masks, only it's a mask for the filter. And that's what I love. So let me zoom out here. Oops, not open. Sorry, Command 0. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Smart Filter here. It's highlighted by those white surrounding boxes. I'm actually going to fill this with black because I only want the sharpening to apply back here, the building, maybe some of the grass and rocks back here. I don't want it to apply to the foreground. So rather than sit there with a brush and brush things out when there's more out than in, I'm going to fill it with black, and then I'm just going to brush where I want the sharpening effect to be applied. So to do that, I need to, and this is where I would say do what, to which you guys would say, fill my layer mask with black. So I'm going to hold down, my black is my foreground color over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Option key and I'm going to click Delete. And now my filter is filled in with black. So it's hiding it from the entire image. Now what I need to do is just go into the image and mask out the parts that I want to stay sharpened, sorry. So I'm going to get to my brush out. So I hit the B key to get to my brush. I'm going to make it fairly large because it's this whole area over here. And I'm just going to start brushing. I have worked with photographers who use this technique all the time to sharpen their image. It's a great, fast way to do kind of like a localized adjustment, a localized sharpening, whether or not you have a camera raw image or not. So you can do it right in Photoshop. So I'm going to switch my foreground background colors. I'm going to brush out this building here. It's kind of sloppy, but you get the idea of what you would be doing. I'm going to brush around, I think as far as the bridge probably. And I might choose to fade some of those things back out. So I'm going to use a smaller brush using my left and right bracket keys, but this time I'm going to change the opacity of my brush. I'm going to change the opacity to about 50% by hitting my 5 on the keyboard. And I'm just going to brush out maybe spots that I know I went into the sky. I don't want them. There we go. So that image is looking pretty good. And if I turn the smart filters on and off, hopefully you can see it. There's quite a bit of sharpening in that building. So that's how you would apply a localized sharpening effect inside Photoshop. And if you have an image that has motion blur in it, open it up. Today might be the day to save it. Go into the Smart Sharpen, convert it to a Smart Object first, sorry. Go into the Smart Sharpen filter, change the type of blur to motion blur, and play around, see what happens. I think you'll like it, especially if you have images that have, cameras that don't have shake reduction, that kind of stuff. The last thing that I want to show you is creating a depth of field using Photoshop. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, there's an image with rocks in here. This one. So creating a depth of field brush is pretty much similar to what we just did in the last exercise with sharpening something in the background by masking it out and just brushing the pieces I wanted back in. This is actually very much the opposite of that. We are creating depth of field by blurring parts of an image because we want to shallow our depth of field and the attention to be paid to a different part of this image. So I might not want some of this background with trees sharpened in my image. I want the attention drawn to the rocks and the textures and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do is the exact opposite of what you would think you need to do. I'm going to first open this in Photoshop. Second, I'm going to duplicate this background layer by doing a Command J. I'm going to rename this high pass right now because I know that's what I'm going to use in a second here. So with the sharpening that we're going to apply to this image, I want to bring up a panel that's going to be in the steps in the book, and it is the layer style panel. And what you're used to is going under effects and you see drop shadows and stuff like that, and you play around with those, and I know you've all played with those. However, have you looked at the blending options? The blending options, when you click on the effects, you go all the way to the very first option, or regardless of what you click on for a layer style, if you go to blending options at the top, it gives you some interesting things in terms of how that layer is blended with layers underneath. Things like blend modes. just like the blend mode drop down in the layer palette, you can also change it here. It's going to mimic, they're going to mirror each other. So whatever you choose in one spot, it's going to do and display in the other spot. So let's say I pick overlay. Overlay is going to be my blend mode for this particular layer. I'm going to leave the opacity at 100%. I have the overall opacity of the layer, and then I have the fill opacity. They're two different things. Down at the bottom, I'm not really going to talk about the rest of this stuff right now, but down at the bottom, what you see is these blend if options. The more you master these options, the cooler things you're going to be able to do in Photoshop, because not only are you blending something with a layer underneath, you are choosing what parts of a certain layer are showing and what parts are blending. So to kind of understand what it's doing, these sliders, I don't know if you'll be able to see this here. As I drag this in, it doesn't help that this is the same image on top of the other image, but as I drag it, what happens is it says on this layer, anything that is 125 or higher is going to appear completely white. Now we're working on a scale of 0 to 255, just like your histogram scale. And what it does when you do that is you start to see the image change a little bit. And what that means is that anything that is that number, highlight or shadow, or higher, it essentially, I don't want to say disappears, because it kind of depends. So I'm in overlay mode. And if you remember what overlay blend mode does, go back to chapter 8 if you don't, remember what overlay does is anything that is, it's the combination of screen and multiply. So anything that is brighter than the pixel values that are brighter than the layer underneath, it does a screened blend with it, brightens it. Anything that is darker, as far as colored pixels, with the layer underneath, it multiplies that, getting a darker result. So this number essentially means that anything 132 and above is considered, I want to say considered white. You're not making it white, but it's considered a white value, and it's going to blend it with the other layer. When you do the underlying layer, it says whatever you're blending with the underlying layer will show through onto the top layer. It's confusing, I get it, but what it's telling me is, in layman's terms, is that as I drag this down, anything that's white or hits this point or above is basically just disappearing. It's hiding it, and it's showing the layer underneath. This is probably easier to understand on an image where there's or two different images, and then when you blend one, it shows different things from the one underneath. But I'm going to set the settings just like he has. What he has is, for this one, he is leaving on this layer, black slider, he's leaving it as is. He is moving the white slider, he's actually leaving it all the way up here. However, he has split this slider. Again, I know it might be a little weird to understand, but I'm hoping it starts to make sense as you play with it. You can actually split this slider and separate it so that it is more of like a gradated change, like a gradient. So it's gradually going from one setting to the other as to how it blends with the layer underneath. Now to split this at any time, you can see the white lines indicate that it could split. You hold down your Option key. This Option key seems to be a good friend of ours lately. The Option key splits that, because without it, it just moves it. The Option key will grab either the left or right side, whatever one I'm using, and split it and move it over. So he blended this about to where I am, about 225, and this is just the highlight area. Now in the underlying area, he left it at 0, but then he took this right one, Option clicked, dragged it up to about 30. And then the same setting down here as above. Split this, option click, did about 225. There we go. I don't know if you can see the difference. It's kind of hard to see. There we go. I mean, you can see how the blend mode's working, but hopefully you can see the difference as you're dragging those sliders. Now for kind of one of the last pieces and the cool part. I am going to apply the high pass filter to this layer. Now if you remember what the high pass filter does, some of you use this in Photoshop. It's a great tool for sharpening. I don't think it'd be the only sharpening setting I'd use, but for just a real quick, I need to punch this just a little bit, this is awesome. High pass filter, you got to remember where it is. It's under the filter menu. It's way down at the bottom. It's under other. Apparently it doesn't fit anywhere even though we use it all the time. And high pass is the second one. So I click high pass. Now on the image itself I don't see a whole lot. Here it's showing me just what the option key does when I'm sliding the different sliders in Camera Raw. It's allowing me to set a certain, essentially a sharpening effect, that it sharpens these edges and then it applies it to that layer, so it's going to look exactly like this. But then when you change the blend modes, something really cool happens. And I just realized I had to do an unsharp mask first, so sorry, let me come back to this high pass. I'm going to go under filter. I'm going to go under sharpen. I'm going to use the unsharp mask filter. So first I'm going to do a little bit of sharpening before I do a little bit more sharpening. So with the unsharp mask, I kind of talked about it just before, I'm going to set this amount, it's going to be kind of ridiculous. I'm going to set this amount all the way up to 500%. I'm going to show a radius of 1, so I'll just leave it there. And the threshold is going to be 0. Now I hit OK. Now I'm going to go to my high pass filter. So back to what we were just talking about. Filter, other, high pass. Then what I'm going to do with these settings is I'm going to put this all the way up to 20. You can see it's kind of over the top, but it's going to look really cool when we're done. So if I zoom in here, I just hit OK. If I turn this layer on and off, you can see a drastic difference in this image. Not only how much it pops, like contrast-wise, but just in the sharpening too. So now the only last step is to figure out, now again, we're trying to create a depth of field. So by creating a depth of field, we could create a greater depth of field or a narrower depth of field. This particular one, I'm going to try and create a greater depth of field. I'm going to use a brush, and I don't want this high pass layer that I've created to be on all parts of this image. I just want it to be on certain parts that are out of focus, like these trees in the background. I want to sharpen that information, so I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here, enough to see this top part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a layer mask to this top layer. Mask. And then I'm going to fill it with black, which we just did on another image. So black is my foreground color. I'm going to do Option, Delete. It fills with black. Now, still with that layer mask active, I'm going to use my brush tool, bring it back to 100% opacity, and swap my foreground and background colors, X, and I'm going to brush over just these areas. So check out what this does to this particular image as we're brushing over it. So what I have essentially done is I have applied a high pass filter to just the parts of my image that needs a little bit more focus. Well, now that we have masked out parts of an image to show sharpening and not apply it to the other ones, we've also used Camera Raw to edit, adjust, apply certain things, sharpening related. You'll go through noise reduction in the textbook, but what I would like to do is explain what you're going to do for your assignment. So, Chapter 3 assignment. What you're going to do is you are going to select 10 images that you want to edit. I don't care if you've done editing ahead of time, whatever it may be. If they're JPEGs, if they're RAW files, it's not going to matter a whole lot at this point. But what you're going to do is you're going to take 10 images, any 10 images that you want, and you're going to sharpen them. Now, I am looking for you to do 5 different sharpening techniques. Again, all of these are in the book. Use the book as a reference, especially to get like exact numbers to use or a starting point and then tweak it from there. But you're going to do these 5 things. You're going to do a portrait image retouch. That will have to be done in Camera Raw. You will do a landscape image sharpening, also an image that has to be in Camera Raw. Fine detail sharpening. There's a great example in the book of trees covered in like snow or ice to do the fine detail. So it's a pretty cool technique. I'd save a preset of that one. So fine detail sharpening, negative sharpening, which we talked about, and then creating depth of field. And that's that last step that we just talked about. So this is kind of a broad assignment because yes, you're going to have 10 images, but I just need you to pick like which image you're going to do the portrait retouching on, which one are you going to do the fine detail sharpening on. And you need to use all 5 of these at least once in your images. But the remaining 5 images can be whatever you feel most comfortable with or find the most useful for that particular image. It's totally up to you what you want to do for that. Now, the last part, please don't forget this. In the caption metadata field of the finished image, and I'm going to tell you this, it is going to be easiest to do in Bridge or Lightroom. If you're working in Bridge already, because you're opening things up in Camera Raw, I would just use Bridge. But in that caption metadata field, you are going to note the type of sharpening that you completed. So if this is a picture of a person and you did portrait image sharpening, apply that to that person, save it in the metadata. So what that looks like in Bridge is, I'm in the Essentials view here, so I'm seeing a bunch of thumbnails. You're going to see a field to put all that information into. So what I would use is the description and then just type out, this is a landscape retouch. Or maybe I should title it what it actually is. This is a creating depth of field. Oops. So I'm just going to type, oops, and I spelled depth wrong. Whoops. Creating depth of field. Woohoo! Whoops, I keep forgetting I can hit return in here. So, creating depth of field, that will save it within the metadata. So if you can do this in Lightroom too. I have a feeling most of you won't, just because you're using Bridge and Photoshop for this work. Type it in the description field. That way when I bring it up, I know exactly which retouching you did, or retouching, sorry, which sharpening effect you did with it, and can grade it properly. But again, the last 5 images that you use for this, you can use any of these, or if you would rather do all creating depth of field for the last 5, that's fine, as long as you have these other ones in at least one image. So you're going to submit that. Most of these will be in Camera Raw. However, when you do this creating depth of field one, that one has to be done in Photoshop. If you use any other technique or combination of sharpening and you bring it into Photoshop, save those as a PSD showing all of your layers. Label those layers where you can and where it's needed. Obviously the background layer you don't have to worry about, but the other ones label. The other ones that are done in RAW, save those as a DNG file so that I can go back to the original, see the original, and then see the sharpening effect that you applied on it and make sure that it's appropriate for that image. The other thing I don't want you to forget, I do want you to do, is that just like in your last assignment, or last couple of assignments really, that we've been working with in Camera Raw, I want you to do the before-after snapshot. So if you need a reminder as to what that is, I'm going to grab this one. So the ones that you adjust in Camera Raw, in this last tab here, I want you to create snapshots. So before you do anything, create a new one that says before, and then do whatever it is you need to do to sharpen that thing with whatever technique you need to use. And then you're going to go back to snapshots. You're going to hit that little new layer looking icon, and then you're going to hit after. You can even type the sharpening technique in here too if it helps. But you still need to do it in the caption field. So now I have the before and the after. So don't forget to do that. Save it, save image, as a DNG right here, digital negative. Shouldn't have to change these settings. And then just decide where it's going to be saved. Usually where the other images were, and then just hit save. So that's what you're going to do there. Obviously PSD needs the layers, and then the caption field. So this assignment's worth 10 points. You'll see the breakdown of the points here. You do get a point reduction if you don't put the captions in there, so that drops you like 10%, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. And then coming into class the following week, you're going to submit the DNG file or the PSD, and we'll be good to go. Then we're going to keep plugging away at the book. We're going to talk a little bit about image size and size adjustments and stuff like that, resizing your image, and really get into some of the other editing techniques. Other than that, you guys should be good to go. Remember that FlexLab for Monday. I will be there for FlexLab, but not at the 1:30 time. I will be there at 3:30, and then I'll be there until the night class starts at 5:30. So if you want some help on Monday, come to FlexLab. There will still be Tuesday FlexLab, but there will not be a Thursday FlexLab next week. If you need additional help outside of the times that are available, just let me know. I'm sure we can set up something and get you the help that you need to complete the assignment. Other than that, I'll see you next week.